Chapter 2023 begins with Riley preparing to greet an unfamiliar guest, Mrs. Lab, who has arrived at the Erickson family's banquet. Riley apologetically offers to have someone escort Cameron inside the house while she goes to meet the guest. However, Cameron, feeling somewhat out of place and unfamiliar with most of the attendees, asks if she can accompany Riley to greet Mrs. Lab. Riley agrees, and they set off together, intrigued by the identity of this mysterious guest. As they walk, Riley expresses her curiosity about Mrs. Lab, noting that she has never heard of anyone with that surname in Wilspoon's upper class circles. The name is completely unfamiliar to her, which only heightens her interest. Cameron then reveals that she has met a Mrs. Lab once before. She recounts an encounter she had at Serenity's bookstore, where she saw a young woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Lab. This woman was very young, likely in her early 20s, and was dressed in expensive clothing and jewelry. According to Cameron, this Mrs. Lab mentioned that she was purchasing information for her brother in law, who was still in kindergarten. Riley is surprised to hear about Mrs. Lab's young age and remarks on how unusual it is for someone so young to be married. She speculates that Mrs. Lab might have gotten married shortly after graduating from college, or perhaps even earlier. The notion of such a young woman being married contrasts sharply with Riley's own situation. Riley, who is approaching 30, remains unmarried and is still recovering from the emotional wounds of a past relationship that ended in heartbreak. Her thoughts reveal her current mindset towards marriage. Having been hurt in love, she is now cautious and more deliberate in her search for a suitable partner. Unlike before, when she might have followed her own instincts alone, she now plans to heed the advice of her elders in choosing a husband, ensuring that she makes a wise and compatible match. This shift in perspective reflects her growth and determination to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. As the conversation continues, Riley mentions that after greeting Mrs. Lab, she intends to keep her distance from the young woman. When Cameron questions why Riley feels this way, Riley explains that her desire to avoid Mrs. Lab has nothing to do with the woman's character, which she knows nothing about. Instead, it stems from the inevitable comparison that will arise between herself and Mrs. Lab in the eyes of her mother. Seeing such a young woman already married will likely intensify her mother's pressure on her to marry, a pressure that she is keen to avoid. She reflects on the relentless marital expectations imposed by her mother. As an unmarried woman nearing 30, she is constantly urged to find a husband, a pressure that is only compounded by the presence of younger women like Mrs. Lab, who are already married. Although she acknowledges that she is not against marriage, she is determined to take her time and find the right person, rather than rushing into a relationship out of societal pressure. Cameron, who has also experienced her share of societal expectations, empathizes with Riley's situation. She offers words of encouragement, expressing confidence that Riley will eventually find a good man who truly loves her. Riley appreciates the sentiment but reiterates that she is not in a hurry to marry. While her mother's persistent urging is a source of stress, she remains focused on healing from her past and finding a partner who is truly right for her. The chapter closes with a reflection on the broader issue of marriage pressure in society. Both women recognize the challenge of dealing with relentless expectations from family and relatives, particularly during holidays and social gatherings. The fear of facing such pressures often leads many unmarried individuals to avoid returning to their hometowns, preferring to escape the constant reminders and urgings to settle down.